Hello, I'm Lindsay from Katy Sue Designs Cakes. Now, here at Katy Sue, we're just always being asked so many questions on how best to use our molds in cake decorating. So we've made a series of videos that are hopefully going to answer all your questions that you need to know on how to use our molds most effectively for best results. So if you're a beginner cake decorator, we're just going to give you all the tips, all the tricks that you need to know to get started using Katy Sue molds in your cake decorating, so you can begin decorating cakes that are just going to amaze your friends, amaze your family, and if you sell cakes, they're going to wow your customers. So let's begin.
First off, the number one question we get asked is, what fondant would you recommend to use with Katy Sue molds? Now, this is an easy one. We recommend to use Renshaw Extra for ease of use with our molds. Now, I always use white and I colour it to whatever shade I need. We'll be covering colours in a later video in this series, so I won't go into that now. But back to the Renshaw, I would describe it as in the middle as far as firmness goes. If you use a fondant that is too soft, when you go to release the fondant decoration from the mould, it can easily go out of shape and be difficult to handle. On the flip side, if you use a fondant that is too firm, it's difficult to get the pliability to add it easily to the mould. So I find this the perfect medium. It's not sticky at all, so it releases nicely from the mould. Now, if you decorate cookies as well as cakes, then this stuff really needs to be your best friend, because the marshmallow flavour that I have here, it just tastes so good. It's so important to have a fondant that tastes good as well as performs well, and this I find is just the perfect combination. So this is what we recommend. It's a good place to start if you're having trouble trying to find a suitable fondant. But of course, if you have a fondant that works for you, that is brilliant. Go ahead and use that. Now, there are times when you will need to mix your sugar paste or your fondant with another product to get a desired result. So this product here is called Tylo powder or CMC powder. It's available from any cake decorating shop, and in your cake decorating arsenal, you will definitely need this. Now, if you're an avid follower of Katy Sue, you will see from our product photos or our social media videos, cakes that are decorated with decorations that stand proud on top of the cakes or stick out from the sides, such as this angel here or this mushroom. You can see that they have all dried beautifully in shape. They haven't flopped and collapsed, and that's because they've all had Tylo or CMC powder added to the fondant before being used in the moulds. And the purpose of the Tylo is that it has made the fondant stronger and firmer, and it dries more quickly and hardens quickly, and it allows you to make all these gorgeous decorations without fear that they are going to wilt and squash. So as a guide, you will need to add around a teaspoon of the CMC Tylo powder for every 250 grams of sugar paste. And I'm just now going to show you how easy this is. I've got my non-stick board and I've got my 250 grams of fondant and a teaspoon of the Tylo powder. Just add it in like that. And all you need to do is knead it together and get all the powder incorporated. So you'll need to knead it for a few minutes just to get that all mixed in. And you can experiment with the amount of Tylo powder you need. It just depends on where you live in the world, how warm it is where you live. If it's very warm, you might need more Tylo powder, but if you live in a colder climate, you might need less. And you can just see here that the Tylo powder is easily being incorporated into the fondant. When you have it all mixed in, you won't be able to use it straight away. The sugar paste will feel exactly the same. It might even be a bit softer because you've been kneading it. So you will need to just wrap it up. I'm going to put mine in an airtight bag and leave that for about 30 minutes. And when you come back to it after 30 minutes, you'll be able to use it. You'll feel that the Tylo powder has worked its magic and made your fondant firmer and ready to start creating some beautiful decorations for your cakes. I also use fondant with some Tylo added when I'm using the Katy Sue texture moulds, such as this continuous honeycomb mould. It guarantees that when you release the design from the mould, that it keeps its shape. It doesn't stretch out when you release it, so that when you add it to the cake, the design stays uniform throughout. The time that I would never add Tylo to my fondant is when I'm decorating cookies with fondant. I find that the Tylo changes the texture and the mouthfeel of the fondant, and I don't recommend that for cookies, as people are going to be eating the whole of the cookie, including all of the fondant, whereas for cakes it's not as important because generally these decorations will be picked off and not all eaten.
We're going to look at colouring fondant and the products that we use and what we would recommend to use when colouring fondant, and also a few tips on how we go about making all the different colour fondants for use on our cakes.
So what we use here at Katy Sue to colour our fondant with are gel colours, and these are all gel colours, and this is what we would recommend you use to colour your fondant with. Because they are gel, they're a thicker consistency and very concentrated, so you really don't need huge amounts to achieve some really great colours. And the brand here is by Rainbow Dust, and the range is called Pro Gel. And here's another brand that we also use, and this is by Fractal Colours. So they're both very similar, they just have their own colour ranges, but as long as you have the basic colours, a green, a blue, a yellow, a red, a pink maybe, then you can use these to mix up your own colours. And what I would recommend is to get a grey and a caramel. These ones are from Rainbow Dust, and then you can add these colours to a basic colour that you've mixed up to create a different tone to that colour. And we will cover that later on in the video, so keep watching for that. Another two colours that I would highly recommend are these ones from Colour Mill. It's from their Aqua Blend range, which is for colouring fondant, and the colours are Latte and Clay, and they are so lovely for adding neutral colours into your colour scheme for your cakes or cookies. These other brands don't have the equivalent of these colours, so these colours are just a must for me. For example, here at Katy Sue, we often use this latte colour as a neutral background colour on the cakes. And we often get asked by our customers what colour we've used, and this one is it. It's just a very modern colour, and it just makes a nice change from white. And just a little tip for when you are stuck for what colours to use and what might complement a main colour that you already know that you are going to use is to look at Pinterest. So I just go to the search and I'll type in something like pink colour palette. So if I'm making a pink cake, if I type in pink colour palette, it will bring up some lovely colour palettes and maybe just throw at me some ideas of colours that I hadn't thought to use with the pink. So here it's showing me two lovely pink colours and two nice greens that go with it. So I might try and recreate those colours. Another example, you can type in autumn colour palette. So if you're making an autumn cake and you think, what colours can I use? Just type it into Pinterest and it just gives you a whole range of ideas for different colours that you can use. And for me, I just find this very helpful. It just helps me start to visualise what my cake might begin to look like. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can start to experiment with your colours and tweak them to create some of those colour palettes like we saw on Pinterest. So here I have coloured this fondant with this pink, and this piece of fondant has been coloured with this blue, and this fondant coloured with this green. And you can just use these colours as they are, but what I'm going to show you in this video is how to take your basic colour and make different tones of that by adding either a grey, which I've made using this grey here, or a caramel made from this Rainbow Dust caramel colour. So if you add some of your grey into the pink, then you change it and you make it into this more dusky pink, I would describe it as. The same, add some grey into the basic blue and it ends up a more dusky blue. Do the same with the green, and again you end up with a different tone of green. I find that the grey cools the colours down somewhat, makes them less vibrant. And the same if you add the caramel. So I've added some caramel into the pink and it's changed it into a more peachy pink. If I add the caramel into the blue, it's changed it into a more of a green, but it's still on the blue scale. And This is the caramel added into this green. It's made a lovely warm green. So from your basic range of colours, you can create just a whole new range of colours just by adding some grey or caramel. And if I just line them up on my hand here, you can see just this lovely new colour palette that we've made. And I haven't had to buy a whole new range of colours to get them. So just experiment and have fun, and you'll soon have a great eye for mixing your own modern colour palettes.
This video is going to cover general tips that you will want to use when working with our moulds. We sometimes get asked the question, how can I stop the fondant sticking in the mould? Well, watch this video because sticking fondant will be a problem for you no more.
Before you use your mould, you will need to do a small bit of prep work on it to save you the headache of the fondant sticking. So there are two ways to stop sticking, and this first way is the way that I would recommend the most. You will need some of this. This is Trex. It's a white vegetable fat. It's available from most supermarkets here in the UK. If you live in the US, you will have a version called Crisco, and if you live in Australia, I believe it's called Kofa. So all you need to do is get your finger or a small paintbrush and just smudge the tiniest amount of the fat into the mould, working the fat into all the little crevices and all the little cracks and details of the mould to stop the fondant sticking. A brush is sometimes easier to use if you have a mould with lots of small details, and remember, it's only the tiniest amount you need, just providing the sheerest of barriers. If you don't have any Trex handy, the other way we would recommend to prepare your mould is to use some corn flour. Again, you only need a small amount, and here I'm just going to use a paintbrush to brush the corn flour into all the areas of the mould. Then just turn your mould over, give it a little tap to get any excess out, and you are ready to go. So let's just show you just how easy this is. You've already seen that I've prepared this mould here with a little Trex. So now I'm going to fill it with some fondant. And I press the fondant firmly into the mould because we want to pick up all the beautiful detail on this baby. A good tip is to not overfill your mould with fondant. Here I've happened to have lucked out and I've chosen the perfect amount to fill my mould with. If you slightly underfill, you can always add a little bit more into the mould to make up the difference. But if you overfill, you'll have to cut away the excess, and that can just sometimes make life a little bit more tricky. Keep pressing the fondant firmly into the mould, making sure that the fondant has reached the very bottom of the mould and picked up all the gorgeous details. And once you're happy that you've done that, the next great tip is to use this lip that Katy Sue has round the bottom of their moulds to flex the mould away from the edges of all parts of the design. By doing this, you will have released the outer parts of the fondant so that the rest will hopefully follow through. So here we go. As you can see, all the edges have been released, and now I've turned the mould over, and working from one side, I'm gradually easing the rest of the fondant out of the mould, and out pops the baby. If only it was that easy to get a baby out in real life. I'm going to run through the process with you again using the teddy bear mould. So with the baby, we smudged some Trex into the mould to stop sticking, and with the bear, we dusted the mould with corn flour. Both will produce the same results. Both will prevent your fondant from sticking in your mould. So I've again added the fondant into the mould. I've tried to estimate the approximate amount, and I'm using my fingers to press the fondant into the mould. Now the bear has got a few more tinier details on it, such as the ears and the arms. So I'm using my Dresden tool here to drag some of the fondant from the centre into these areas. I find it easier to use a little tool like this Dresden tool to do this rather than my fingers, because the tool is smaller than my fingers, and also you would probably want to use one of these if you have quite hot hands, as it stops the fondant from sticking to your fingers. I've underfilled the mould here a little bit, so I've just got to add a little bit more fondant here where the bear's arms are. Another top tip I would give is don't use freshly coloured fondant in your moulds. Fondant that's saturated with colour can be so sticky to start with, and it will just get stuck in your mould. So make sure you pre-colour your fondant, ideally the day before, or even if you do it just an hour ahead, that will give the fondant time to absorb the colour. So same as we did with the baby, use that bottom lip on the mould to flex the mould to release the outer edges of the fondant, and turn the mould over and gradually ease the rest of the fondant out of the mould.
We want you to get the best out of your Katy Sue molds. So in this video, we are going to show you how to use a mold with more intricate detail, as these require just a little bit more care and patience. So here are our tips so that you can use any Katy Sue mold with ease and confidence.
When you are working with a mould such as this carousel horse, which has so much fine detail and very delicate areas such as the legs here, you do have to be a little bit more careful. You want to make sure that you bring out all that detail, but you also want to be able to get the fondant out of the mould without stretching or breaking the legs as you do so. Firstly, we need to prepare the mould, and how we do this, we covered this in a previous video, but I'm just going to quickly show you here. Get some Trex, which is a white vegetable fat, put some on the end of a small paintbrush and brush the Trex into all the little areas of the carousel horse so that no fondant will get stuck inside the mould. The fondant that I'm going to be using to add to the mould has already been prepped, so this means that I've added Tylo to the fondant to give it more strength. I go into more detail about adding the Tylo in a previous video, so please see that video if you are unsure. Once you're happy that you've added the Trex properly to your mould, it's time to add the fondant. Now, don't add too much fondant to your mould or it will become very difficult for you. It's always okay if you haven't added enough fondant, as you can always just pop a bit more extra in if needed. So with a mould like this, I place the main bulk of fondant in the middle, and then I will sort of push the fondant to the outer areas, the smaller areas of the mould, like the head, the tail and the legs. So just keep working it over, trying to get some more into the areas that we will need to fill shortly. And first off, I'm going to start by filling the poles of the carousel horse because I find those the most fiddliest areas, so I'm going to get them out of the way first. And I'm using my 2 index fingers just to work some of the fondant from the centre up to the top of the pole. And I'm going to use my Dresden tool now just to be able to smooth the fondant down. I find sometimes using the Dresden tool is easier than using my fingers. Sometimes the fondant might get stuck to my fingers, especially if it's a hot day, or some people have especially hot hands. So you will find something like the Dresden tool a lifesaver for you when you're filling the moulds. So now I'm working some of the fondant down to the bottom pole, and I'm going to use my Dresden tool again just to help me do this. You will find that a mould like this, it does take a little bit more time, but the extra effort really is worth it. And once you're happy that you've sufficiently filled the areas of the pole, I'm now going to start working on the head area. So I've already managed to pull some fondant from the centre into the head area, and I'm going to use my Dresden tool. I'm not sure if you can clearly see it on this video, but there's some little sort of spiky bits of the mane on top of the head, and the Dresden tool really helps me to get that fondant into that area so that the fondant can show up all the beautiful detail of the horse's mane. And I just need to add a little bit more fondant here because there's not quite enough. Like I say, it's always better to be able to add a little bit more fondant rather than adding too much fondant and trying to have to take it away. In those situations, you would need to use something like a palette knife just to gently scrape away over the top, scrape away the excess. So I'm just adding in the extra little pieces of fondant as I need it, and I think that's okay now for the head. And now I'm going to move myself over to the tail area. And I do have to just be a little bit more careful when working on the tail area because the mould does become a little bit shallow here. So when I'm pushing the fondant over from the body into the tail, I'll just do that carefully with my Dresden tool, and I haven't quite got enough fondant, so I do need to just add some more in. And this is where the Dresden tool really is a lifesaver, getting the fondant into all the little flourishes at the end of the horse's tail and pressing the fondant down firmly so it's not sticking to my fingers, and picking up the design of the horse hair. So as I said, this is a mould that really you do need to take your time with. It's got so much detail in it, so many areas like the legs and the pole, which can be quite delicate. So you need to take your time with a mould like this and make sure that you're doing it right, because you don't want to get to the end when it comes to trying to get your carousel horse out of the mould. And if you haven't taken your time, you've rushed it, then you might not be able to get it out of the mould properly. And we don't want that, especially after you've spent so much time doing it. So just carry on adding extra pieces of fondant as needed, using your Dresden tool, using your fingers to really push the fondant into the mould. And now I've turned my mould the other way round so that I can start working on the leg area, and I'm pushing some of the main bulk of fondant from the body into the leg area, and I can see that I just haven't got enough fondant here. So if you just add it on top, and then you can begin using your Dresden tool to start filling up the rest of the legs in the mould. Pay particular attention when you are filling the mould here. We really want to make sure that we are filling the whole depth of the mould with fondant. We don't want any shallow areas of fondant where we haven't quite filled the mould enough, because this could be a weak point when it comes to demoulding your carousel horse. So I'm really making sure that I have got the fondant filled up level to the top of the mould. And again, I'm just pressing all the fondant down into the mould, so I'm picking up all the details of the hooves. Sometimes I even like to add an extra piece of fondant on top where the legs meet the body, just to make sure that I've really strengthened that area so that when I demould the carousel horse, I'm not going to lose a leg. So I've moved over to the other front set of legs now, and I'm filling up the mould here in the same way that I filled up the back legs, adding more fondant as needed, pushing it down into the mould to make sure that it fully fills the whole mould. So we have nearly got to the end of filling our carousel horse mould. I'm just going to make sure that all the fondant is pressed firmly into the mould, because as I say, there's so much detail on this mould. You really don't want to miss out on any of the detail. It's absolutely beautiful. So just give it a once over, pushing it down again just to make sure that you've captured all the detail. I would rather be doubly sure that I've pressed down onto the mould, making sure that I've picked everything up, rather than half-heartedly done it and demoulded my carousel horse and missed out some of the detail on the saddle or something. That would really annoy me. So this is why I take my time doing this mould and really making sure that I've picked up every detail. And I've just added a little bit more fondant here onto the tail, because I don't want to break that area when it comes to demoulding the horse from the mould. I'm just about done now, and now it's time to start flexing the edge of the mould, and this brings the mould away from the very edges of the fondant. We have to be very gentle around the legs when we're flexing the mould here, because we don't want to stretch and break them. So just take your time when you're flexing the mould around the areas such as the legs and the pole. Continue working your way round, and again be very gentle on the tail area of this mould, because we don't want to break that off either. And we're just about done now, and we can start to demould our horse. So with a mould like this, I find it best to start the demoulding from the head side, which is more bulky, and then I'll just let the legs follow through because I don't want them to break off. So turn your mould over, flex the mould, and start releasing it from the head side, just gently and slowly, and then the legs will follow through, and here we just have our beautiful carousel horse.
If you want your moulded cake decoration to really pop, a great way to do this is to use more than one colour fondant in your mould at the same time. So keep watching and I will show you how to achieve this for best results.
Our flower moulds are great to add more than one colour fondant into. They look so effective, with the petals being one colour and the centre being another colour. And the principles of adding colours will work the same whether you're just adding one colour or 5 colours. So you'd want to brush your mould with some Trex or some corn flour, and then just start by adding a small piece of fondant into the centre. Now be careful, don't overfill this area, because when you put the next colour on top, we don't want that to bleed over into the other area because you've overfilled it. Then take your second colour of fondant and just fill in the rest of your mould. So I'm just going to use my Dresden tool here to spread the fondant out from the centre into all the different petal areas. I find it much easier to use something like the Dresden tool for moulds like this when you're spreading out your fondant, because you're trying to get that fondant into quite a small area, and if you use your fingers, sometimes your fingers are a bit too big, and also it just helps stop the fondant sticking to your fingers. So that's all done now. I'm just going to use my fingers just to make sure the fondant is pressed down into the bottom of the mould, and just smooth the edges of the petals off. And now we can start to demould the flower, and it should just pop out very easy because it's quite a small mould. So I'm just going to flex a little bit around the edge, turn it over and flex the mould, and out pops this gorgeous flower here. And this flower is now ready to use as it is, but if you prefer it to dry in a more cupped position, then leave it to dry overnight either on a flower former, or like me, I'm just going to use a simple egg box to dry my flower. So I've shown you how to add the different colours into the flowers, and I'm now going to show you how to do it with another mould, and that's our sweater hat and mittens mould. I'm going to use some white fondant for the trim part of the hat and the bobble on top, and then the main part of the hat is going to be a different colour. So roll a little sausage for the trim and use your Dresden tool to work the fondant into that area of the mould. What I'm going to do here is that I'm making the fondant taper down towards the middle of the mould, so that you can layer the hat colour over the top of that, and that will give it something to adhere to. And the same with the bobble of the hat, just pop a bit of white into the bobble. I've put a bit too much there, so I'm just going to get rid of some, and then I'm going to use my tool to press that in and make it slope down again to the hat area, so that now when I add the blue over the top, the blue will sit slightly over both those white areas of fondant so that it all sticks together nicely. You can even add the tiniest smear of edible glue to the white before you add the blue. That will just guarantee then that it all sticks together. And sometimes I like to do that when I'm working on a complicated mould where I've added in lots of different colours. And as per with every mould, just give it a little flex around the edge before you turn it over and release the fondant from the mould. And here is the little hat, and I just think it looks so cute when you've added different colour fondants into the mould.
One of my favourite ways to add interest to cakes or cookies is to use the Katy Sue texture moulds. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to capture all the details in the texture moulds, and with the continuous texture moulds, how to line them up for a seamless finish on your cakes.
So first I'm going to show you how to use this texture mould. This is the continuous honeycomb mould, and it's actually a very clever mould because it tessellates together. So you make several of these moulds and then you can line them all up and they join together like a puzzle for a seamless finish, and you can wrap it around your cake. So first you use some Trex or corn flour on your mould so that the fondant won't stick. Then you just take a piece of fondant, which I have earlier added some Tylo powder to this to make it dry firmer, as I want it to be able to wrap around the cake easy. If I don't add any Tylo to my fondant, it will make it tricky to pick up and add to the cake because it will be too floppy, and no one likes floppy fondant. So all I'm doing is rolling my fondant out to the approximate size of the mould, and for this mould I've actually used around 70 to 75 grams. That is the perfect amount that I have found to fill this mould. And you will want to roll your fondant into this rectangular shape, and it will really make your life a lot easier if you can get it to the approximate size of the mould and shape. So add your fondant to your mould. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press in the middle of the fondant, in the middle of the mould, just to kind of get that held in place so it doesn't move about. And use a little bit of corn flour on your fingers if you find that the fondant is a little bit sticky on your hands. And now I work my way to the corners of the mould, and I really want to get these corners in the right position. So move from corner to corner, pushing the fondant out from the middle to reach the very corners of your mould. It just helps to keep the fondant held in the right place so that then you can begin working on the edges of the mould. So I think I've got the corners in the right position now, and they are filled in nicely. And now I'm just going to work along the top edge, and I'm just tidying that edge up there, making the fondant follow the edge of the mould in that zigzag pattern. And because I've used the 70 to 75 grams, I don't have a lot of excess to try and cut away because it's just filling the mould perfectly. And now I'm just going to work down the side of the mould, and you do just have to take your time when you do this. You want to pick out the detail on the side of the mould because this is where your mould is going to tessellate together if you're using more than one piece to add around the edge of a cake. I'm really pressing the fondant quite firmly into the design here. I really want to anchor the fondant in place and make sure that I'm bringing out that design. And remember, if your fingers are beginning to stick to the fondant, then just dip them in some corn flour. That'll just help dry them out, stop the fondant from sticking to your fingers, because you don't want to be pushing the fondant into the mould and have your hot sticky fingers then pulling the fondant out again. So I'm now working on the other side, just repeating the process, pushing that fondant firmly down in position, getting it all held in place and making sure that we are really picking up on that design on the outer edge of the mould. And that's all about done now, and now it's time to start working on the middle of the mould because we haven't really paid much attention to it. So we really want to make sure that all areas of the fondant have been pressed down firmly into the mould so that we aren't missing out on any of the design on the fondant. So just work your way across and down with your fingertips, pressing the fondant firmly in place. Once you are happy that you have pressed sufficiently all over your fondant, you're pretty confident that you've picked up all the design, I just like to use a final reassurance that I've done this sufficiently by using a fondant smoother over the top of all of the fondant, and I've just added a little bit of corn flour onto the top of the fondant and my cake smoother here. So just use your fondant smoother just to give it a final press down before we then release this fondant from the mould. And the fondant smoother really just helps to ensure that the fondant is of an equal depth all the way throughout the mould. It's just ironing out those lumps and bumps so that when you go to add it onto your cake, it's just going to be the same depth all the way across the mould. So just give it one last press, and now it's time to release our fondant from the mould and see the beautiful honeycomb design that we've got imprinted on our fondant. So as with any mould, turn the mould over and just flex it from the top edge and slowly pull it back, and there is our design. And what you'll need to do is you can just set this piece aside and you can begin making more of these, and the number you make will just depend on how big the cake is that you are going to add it to. So now you've made your extra pieces, it's time to start thinking about adding them to the cake. And you can see that because this piece has been left to sit out and dry for about 20 minutes, it's a lot easier to handle, and this is what we want when we want to add it to the cake. We don't want it to be flopping, we want it to be firm and easy to handle. So I've just got 2 pieces here, but you will probably have a few more tiles if you're wrapping this design around the whole side of a cake. So line them up, add them all together in line, because I'm going to show you how to trim your design. So I want to trim along the bottom edge, and what I use is a quilter's ruler because they're really long and I just find them so handy for sugar craft work, and a pizza wheel. And line your quilter's rule along the bottom of all your tiles and make a cut where you need to. You might not have to trim your tiles at all, it just depends on what your cake design is, but I want my tiles to be flush with the bottom edge of the cake. If your design requires it, you can also measure the height of your cake and then trim your tiles to the same height as your cake if you want a flush top edge. And when you are satisfied with the measurements of your pieces, they are now ready to add to the sides of your cake. So now I'm going to show you how we add the different sections onto the cake. As you can see, I've already added the first section. So now I'm going to add the second section. And how you do this is you brush some edible glue onto the sides of your cake, so that holds the fondant section in place. As you can see, I'm using a dummy cake, but you will be using a real cake, and just follow the same instructions. It just works the same whether you're using a dummy or a real cake. So make sure you get the little bits of glue into the tiled section down the edge here. And here is our second section, and because we've allowed it to dry off, you can see that it hasn't stretched out of place when I've picked it up. I can pick it up quite easily. Now just place it gently in position on the side of your cake. Just use a gentle light touch just to press the fondant against the sides of the cake. Don't be too heavy-handed because you don't want to mark your fondant, and just use your fingertips just to make sure that those panels are blended together so that you can't see a seam where they meet. I'm going to show you the process again by adding the next panel. So again, just brush the sides of your cake with the edible glue, making sure you get an even coverage. You don't need to use huge amounts. You don't want to create a pool of glue at the bottom of your cake. So just be careful of that when you're adding it on. Just a small amount onto the sides of your cake, getting into the crevices there at the edge of the pattern. And then get your next section and again, just place it on very gently,
using your cupped palm just to gently press it into the sides of the cake so as to not distort the pattern of the honeycomb. I'm using a dummy cake here, so the cake is moving around somewhat. You will find this so much easier on a real cake because the real cake has more weight to it, so it won't be moving about as you're trying to add the fondant onto the cake. And that's all there is to it. As you can see, I've left this top edge with this pattern on the top. You can cut it so it's flush with the cake, but I quite like the look of it, like that standing proud over the top edge of the cake. Texture moulds are also a great way to add interest to your cookies and your cupcakes. So here I have the cross stitch mould, and it's one of my favourites to use on cookies as it's such a versatile design. So this is just very easy, very simple, and I'm just rolling out a piece of fondant, just a small piece of fondant I require here because this is going to go on top of a cookie. And get your texture mat, which you have brushed with some corn flour or put some Trex over it, and then just press your piece of fondant onto the texture mat. Use some corn flour on your fingers if you find that the fondant is sticking to your fingers, and then just use a cake smoother just to press the fondant firmly into the mould so that we're picking up all of the cross stitch design on the mould. You could use a rolling pin to roll your fondant over your mould, but sometimes I do find that that distorts the design, so I like to do it this way. Turn your mould over and flex your mould and pull it back, and we're left with this beautiful cross stitch design. And you can add this to the top of a cookie straight away, or if you let it dry overnight, it can become a cupcake topper. Some of our moulds here at Katy Sue are two-part moulds, and these are fantastic because it means that when you assemble the different elements of the mould together, you create a more 3D decoration, which just look great on the top of cakes or surrounding the sides of the cakes. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to use these two-part moulds and just how easy it is.
Here's one of our two-part moulds, and this is our Flower Pro pine cone mould. And what you can do is you can make two halves of the pine cone and then glue them together, and they will make one whole 3D pine cone. So first off, prepare your mould. I'm just going to use a little bit of Trex in the mould to stop the fondant sticking. And then I've got some fondant here, and this has had some Tylo powder added to it so that it's going to dry firmly in shape. And then press your fondant into your mould. Now the fondant wants to be flush with the top of your mould. You don't want it to be underfilled and you don't want it to be overfilled. So just make it flush with the top of your mould. And then because we want this to stick out from our cake, we need to attach it with something, and I'm going to use a cocktail stick. So I'm just going to put a little bit of edible glue on the end of the cocktail stick. You can use a piece of spaghetti or a floral wire if you prefer. Now the great thing about these Flower Pro moulds is that they have this little slot here at the bottom to allow for your floral wire or cocktail stick to sit. Press that into the fondant and just pull some of the fondant over the top of the cocktail stick so that that's embedded in there. Now it's time to turn this half of the pine cone out, so I'm just going to flex the mould around the edge and then turn this decoration out of the mould. So that's one half of the pine cone, and we now need to make the other half. So I'm just going to set this to the side and then get our mould and make the second half of it. So just repeat the process exactly the same as we just did. Remember, you don't want the mould to be overfilled or underfilled. We want it to be flush with the top. Now this is quite important because if they're not flush with the top of the mould, then the two halves of the pine cone just aren't going to fit snugly together. The next step of the process is to dip a paintbrush in some edible glue because we want to paint this top surface. I just have a bit too much on the brush there, so I've just wiped a bit off. Paint the whole top surface with the edible glue, reaching right out to the edges so that when we join the next piece on, they can connect together properly. And get your other half of your pine cone and pop it straight on top of the other piece. Press it very gently down. You don't want to distort your fondant at all. And then gently flex the mould, and that should release the second half of the pine cone because it's stuck to the top half of the pine cone. And there we go. A beautiful 3D pine cone that you can use to decorate your cakes with.
I just absolutely love border molds. I think you can see that I've used them on every single cake here. I will never stop using them. They just add that perfect finishing touch to your cake, that extra bit of pizzazz. And I also love using them on cookies too. So let's take a look at how we use border molds.
So the mould that we're going to be looking at today is this serrated rope border mould from Katy Sue, and we're going to be working on the middle-sized rope. And I've already rolled a piece of fondant into a long sausage shape. And you want the thickness of it to be about the width of that medium-sized rope because we have to fit the fondant into that gap. This fondant has had Tylo added to it, and the mould has been brushed also with some corn flour. So start by feeding the fondant into the end of your border mould, and I'm just using my 2 index fingers just to press it down into the rope mould, and work your fondant all the way to the very end of the mould. If you want your border to wrap all the way around your cake, then this sausage shape will need to be just slightly longer than the circumference of your cake that you're covering. And once you've reached the very end of your mould, just go back over the fondant with your finger, making sure that it's firmly in the mould. And then I'm just going to neaten up this edge here too. Now, if you don't need a very long piece of border, you can just cut it off just here. But what we're going to do is we're going to carefully turn your mould over and release the section of mould that you've already done. And now, because we've made quite a long piece of fondant, we can then begin feeding that back into the mould and carrying on with the border. So if you just find a place where your pre-moulded bit will just already slot in, and then you just carry on feeding the rest of the fondant into the mould like we just did before. And then this way, when we come to demould this section, you will see that the 2 sections have seamlessly moulded together so that when you add it to your cake, it will just be one continuous rope and you won't get any join lines. And just be careful when you have to turn your mould over because we don't want to break the rope section that you've already made. So carefully turn that over and then flex the mould to release the rest of the design, and you can see that it's joined together beautifully and you can't see any joins. So I'm just going to cut this here to show you that you can still make a continuous border even if you haven't rolled a long enough piece of fondant. So I'm just going to feed this into the mould here, into the place where it fits, and then get a piece of rolled out fondant, and I'm just going to add it and connect it to the previous piece that's already in the mould, and then just continue feeding it through the mould like we did before to make the rope border. And this will also provide a seamless join. I've shown you here how to do this with our serrated rope mould, but this will work the same with any of our border moulds. They will all work in the same way so that you can create one continuous length of border just by following these instructions.
Here at Katy Sue, we have such a variety of moulds. Some moulds are very deep and some moulds are very shallow, so they require different techniques when adding fondant to the mould. So let's run through a few tips that will help you when working with deep or shallow moulds.
So first off, I'm going to show you one of our deeper moulds, and this is our seashells mould. And as you can see, this shell here is quite a deep mould, and the first thing we need to do, as with any of our moulds, is to prepare it. And we're going to use some corn flour, so dust some corn flour into the cavity and then just tap out the excess. Next, take a piece of fondant that's had the Tylo powder added to it, roll it into a kind of a sausage shape and push this into the centre of the mould, really making sure that it's reaching the bottom of the mould, and then press all the fondant firmly in, making sure that it's filling the whole cavity of the mould. You can press quite firm here, as we really want to make sure that we don't miss out on any detail. And then our mould is now ready, so I'm just flexing the edge and turn it over, and then you can turn your decoration out. And as you can see, it's come out just perfect. And now I'm going to show you how to use our shallow moulds, and this is our feather mould, and as you can see, it's quite a shallow mould. Now the trick to using shallow moulds is to first use the white vegetable fat on your mould. So get some Trex and rub it over your mould. It's better to use Trex instead of corn flour on shallow moulds, as the Trex will help to hold the fondant in place as you're working it in. So next, take a piece of fondant and make it the approximate size of your mould. So I'm going to roll it into a sausage around about the length of this feather, and then begin to start pressing the fondant into the mould. And the Trex is helping to keep the fondant in place. What you will find is that when you're working with shallow moulds, the fondant sometimes tries to lift out of the mould as you're working it in, but the Trex really does help keep it anchored in place. Also, it's a really good idea to use a Dresden tool when you're working with shallow moulds. Sometimes the heat from your fingers can start to pick the fondant up, but we don't want that because we don't want to pull it out of the shallow mould. So use your Dresden tool where you can, and that will really help you just keep the fondant in place while you're working it into the mould. Another reason why I often prefer to use Trex in my moulds instead of corn flour is because the Trex won't leave any marks on your final decoration, whereas the corn flour can often leave a dusty residue on your decoration, which can be noticeable, especially if you've used a deeper colour fondant like black or red. So this is now ready to come out of the mould, and just flex your mould back to release the decoration.
In some cases, you will need to let your moulded fondant decoration dry out before you are able to add it to your cake. So in this video, we are going to look at drying your fondant decorations and also using edible paints to paint your moulded fondant decoration.
There are times when you'll need to let your decorations dry off before you want to add them to the cake. Now, of course, you can just add your decoration straight to your cake. If you want it to be stuck to the side of a round cake, for instance, just do that, that's fine. But if you want your decoration to stand proud of the side of the cake or sit on top of a cake, then you'll need to let your decoration dry off. And we would say they take at least 24 hours to dry off, or if not more. Use a foam pad like this to dry your decorations on, because this allows the air to get underneath the decoration and dry it from the top and the bottom. If you try to dry your decoration off on something like this, a worktop, then it will just take so much longer to dry. So this is why we recommend a foam pad. This decoration has been allowed to dry off before using edible glue to add an acrylic stick onto the back so it could be used as a cake topper. In the next part of this video, I'm going to show you how you can paint your moulded decorations. So I've just made this unicorn in a white fondant, and now I'm going to show you how you can add colour using edible paints. What we're going to use to paint our unicorn with is we're going to use these dust colours. And there's so many different brands of these, so many different colours on the market, but I'm just going to use these ones today. And what you need to mix it with to make it into a paint is some Rejuvenator Spirit. It's made of a very high alcohol content, which means that when you paint it on the surface of your fondant, it evaporates almost straight away, so that the surface of your fondant is not left all wet and tacky like it would be if you mixed your dust colours with something like a vodka, which doesn't have as high an alcohol content. So I'm just going to get a plate, and then I'm going to pour a little bit of my dust colour onto my plate and then mix it with the Rejuvenator fluid. You can adjust the consistency to however you prefer your paint style to look. So if you want a more watercolour look, then use a bit more rejuvenating fluid, or if you prefer a more opaque look, then use a little less rejuvenating fluid. So I'm just going to start with some pink, and I'm going to start by painting one of these flowers on the unicorn's mane. I have let the unicorn dry off a bit before I begin painting. It just gives it that extra bit of time to firm up, and if I knock it with my hand as I'm painting, it's less likely to leave a mark on it. So that's why I prefer just to let it dry off a little bit before you begin any painting work. So I'm planning on painting this unicorn quite a few different colours because it's got this beautiful mane on it, and I'm going to paint that in lots of different colours. So obviously that's going to be quite a slow process and quite boring for you to watch. So we're just going to skip all that for you and show you the final result with the unicorn all being painted. So here's the final painted unicorn, and I've added some gold luster paint just to make it a little bit more magical, and some black for the eye to make it really pop.
Now you've used your Katy Sue moulds, you've made some beautiful cake decorations, and now you want to know how you're going to stick them to the sides of your cake. In this video, we are going to show you how to do just that.
So to stick your edible cake decorations to your cake, you will need some of this. This is an edible glue, and I've actually made this myself. You can buy edible glue from cake decorating supply shops, but it's so simple to make yourself, and that's what I always do. And to make it, we will be making it with something that you already have, and that will be Tylo powder. So all you need to do is just get a little pot and pour a small amount of the Tylo powder into the pot. As you can see, I really am just using a small amount, just a couple of pinches of the Tylo powder, and then to that you add some boiled water, and that's all there is to it. It is just so easy and quick. Just give it a stir with a paintbrush, and you will need to make this in advance because, as you can see, the Tylo powder doesn't instantly readily mix with the water. That will take a couple of hours, and it will all come together to make a smooth edible glue that you can use to decorate your cakes with. So now you want to add your moulded decoration to the side of your cake, and you'll just want to use a little bit of your edible glue that you've made, paint it on the back of the flower with a paintbrush, and then just hold it in position for a few seconds. You don't have to press very hard, and you don't want to press very hard because we don't want to damage the decoration, but just hold it there for a few seconds and then that will be stuck.